Okay, so that's it for the actual content in terms of the area of study, areas of study 1 and 2. So hopefully everything's making sense. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. But now we're looking at scientific skills. So again, super, super important both this year across both units and next year across both units. You'll have your kind of area of study 3. So you'll have, it might be a test, it might be a poster, you might be doing your experiment. Next year in psych, again, it can vary between schools, but you will most likely be doing perhaps a poster or some kind of logbook or formulating your own experiment. So it's really important to get a good understanding of these terms. So in terms of an actual poster or a scientific report, you'll have these different sections. You need to be confident in what each one involves. So introduction is often like your background, why you're doing the experiment, what previous knowledge there is on this topic. Methods is step 1, step 2, step 3. How am I doing this experiment? Results, what are the measurements, the data, discussion, based on, in the instruction and the results, how can I tie these together and what do these actually mean? And then the conclusion is basically a little summary of that. So in terms of really, really important things that we're thinking of, hypothesis. So if you're going to conduct experimental research or an investigation, you need to have an assumption or an expectation of what's going to happen. So you need to include these 4 things. So iPod. Again, you'd be pretty confident with these things from, junior science and stuff like that. With psych, something that is a little bit more specific is this idea of population and operationalizing your variables as well. So your independent variable, the thing that you manipulate, the thing that you change, the dependent variable is the thing that you measure. Population is where the sample is drawn from. So unlike, your biology or your chemistry, with psych, when we're doing research, we're doing it with participants who are humans. So that's where the main variation is. Whereas we're not doing it with enzymes, we're not doing it with plants, that sort of thing. So you have a population, you have a sample of participants, and these are drawn from a bigger population. So in your hypothesis, you need to refer to the population. You can imagine, are you doing it in kids? Are you doing it in adults? Are you doing it in people who have an IQ of, 200? Are you doing it in people that have Alzheimer's, dementia? Are you doing it in women that have dementia? Are you doing it in all, there's so many different populations. If you exclude population, it is almost unhelpful because you don't know who you're going to apply this to. You don't know who you're going to generalize the results to. So it's really, really important to outline your population. And it can be really broad. Australians, Victorians, it can be really big, but you just have to outline it. Operationalizing, that basically means just being specific with your variables. So your IV and your DV, instead of perhaps if your DV, let me think, will have better memory, will, recall more. It's this idea of how are you measuring it? We'll score higher on a recall test. We'll remember more words on a recall test. Dependent variable will have greater athletic ability. What is that by? We'll be able to run further. We'll be able to run 100 meters in a shorter time. It's just being very specific with your variables. So here's an example. So Australian adults who read at least 1 book per week will score higher on a standard IQ test than Australian adults who don't read books at all. So very specific, as you can see here, clear mention of the population and your variables. A really important thing, I remember my teacher used to always say this to us. Always remember the comparison. It's very easy. And I feel like, again, in your general science and your biology and stuff like that, it's easy to just make the inference of what's going to happen in the experimental group. So Australian adults who read at least 1 book per week will score higher on a standard IQ test. So many students just leave it there. You have to mention your experimental group and your control group. You've got to mention both interventions, basically. So Australian adults, blah, 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 score higher on an IQ test compared to Australian adults who don't read books at all. So you have to include that other one. Otherwise, Australian adults who read at least one book per week will score higher on a standard IQ test than who? Like, you can infer that it's people who read at least less than one book. But technically, it could be score higher on an IQ test than Australian adults who read 10 books, who read 50 books, who read ebooks. You have to be specific. You have to basically cover all of the variables, all of your groups. Okay, these are just some kind of like general things to be aware of. Not using personal pronouns, not being very opinionated, I guess you could say. So, using language such as amazing and things like that, and using psychological jargon as well. It's a formal piece of writing. It's not casual. Okay, super, super, super important slide here. Knowing your experimental designs. So your independent groups, again, you know what I'm going to say. As the name suggests, 2 groups, independent, not mixing with each other. One's got one thing, one's got the other. So you're in the control group or you're in the experimental group. So you're receiving the, intervention or you're not. So, you're receiving the drug for Alzheimer's or you're not. You're doing the memory tests, I don't know, under the influence of alcohol or not. It's this idea of one group being the experiment, receiving the actual thing, and one being the baseline or the comparison. So this is the most common one you'll see. So compared to the others, lower cost, lower time. However, a big drawback of it is that there can be individual participant differences. So there are things that will control for that, such as random allocation, random sampling, stuff like that. That helps, but there may still be these participant differences because you've got different people in different groups. It may just be that, more of them have a higher IQ just randomly compared to others, or more of them, I don't know, have a greater experience doing, something than the others. So that's kind of a bit of an issue that can arise. Matched participants controls for that issue. So you don't have, or you minimize a lot participant differences because you basically have your independent groups, but rather than just allocating everybody randomly, you find participants that are similar on a certain characteristic. So let's say you're doing an experiment on memory. So with independent groups, you get your sample and you go, okay, flip a coin, you're in that one, you're in that one, you're in that one, you're in that one. You have no control, like it's randomized. So again, that's helpful. You're not purposely moving people about. But it means that just by chance, perhaps people with really good memory are in one group, people with poor memory are in the other. With matched participants, you get your participants and you give them a memory test, and whoever matches up, these 2 people have the lowest memory, these 2 people have the highest memory, these other people, these other pairs have a very similar memory score on the test. And then, so you've got your pairs and then you allocate 1 to each group. So it's almost that they're the same, really. You kind of see them as one person for the sake of this, hence the name matched participants. So it controls for those individual differences, but as you can imagine, it's very time consuming and costs a bit more. And also if one person drops out, that whole pair is gone. So that's an issue as well. Repeated measures. So basically you've got one group of participants. They do both the experimental group and the control group kind of task. So this obviously is the best in terms of you don't have any participant differences because everybody is doing the same thing. However, you come into this idea of order effect. So it's this idea that the results can be skewed because the participants are repeating the same task. So perhaps they might get bored of it. Their results will be, different than what it would have been if they hadn't done it before. Or they do the task and they get good at it. They've had practice at it. So the second time, they're just naturally better, So even though they've gotten this new drug or intervention, even without it, they would have scored higher because they've had practice at it. So that's where this idea of counterbalancing comes in, which we'll mention. So in terms of actually getting your group of participants, you've got your population. So your population is year 12s, yeah, year 12s in Victoria, right? That's a population. So every single year 12 in a Victorian school. You will then sample. So perhaps you get 3 year 12s from each school in Victoria. That's your sample. And then you randomly allocate them to the experimental and the control group. So it's important to understand the difference between sampling and allocation. Sampling is actually picking who is going to participate in my experiment. Allocation is who is going to be in the control group, who's going to be in the experimental group. So you'll have random sampling, which is randomly picking who's going to participate, and random allocation, which is randomly picking who's going to be in what group. Okay, so you guys may be familiar with blinding as well. So again, all of these steps are to prevent anything affecting the DV that isn't the IV. So you guys may be familiar with like confounding variables. Basically, all of these steps are random sampling, random allocation, your independent groups design or your matched participants design, your counterbalancing. You're wanting to avoid anything influencing the results that you don't want to. So if you're testing a drug, you want to figure out how this drug is, improving memory, right? You don't want an individual's age or an individual's IQ or an individual's expectation of what the drug will do to influence their results, practicing, the order effect. You don't want any other variable that is not this drug to cause a change in their memory ability, basically. So single blind and double blind, it basically conceals which group the participant is in so that the participant doesn't, often like unconsciously influence the results. So if you are testing, improving like a headache with Panadol or some other miracle drug, if you tell the person, okay, you are receiving this miracle drug, or if you tell the person you are not receiving this miracle drug, that's going to influence their responses. So, how much has your headache reduced? I know that I was told I'm taking this miracle drug, so I'm sure it's done really well. I feel better. I feel more energetic, all that kind of stuff. Whereas someone who has not been taking anything, who knows that they're not receiving this miracle drug, they're not expecting any improvement. So they're going to say, I don't have any improvement. So that's the point of a single blind, not telling the participants what group they're in. Double blind is not telling the participants and also not telling the researchers or the, assessors, the people who are analyzing it, what groups you are in. Because if you are the experimenter or the assessor and you go, okay, this person is in the drug group, you may unconsciously, kind of ask them questions or hint that you want them to be giving certain replies. Or even when you're interpreting data, you may think like, oh, okay, I think they're in this group, so they should be acting like this, and stuff like that. So that's why double blinds are usually the thing that you want to aim for. Standard deviation. So this is just kind of terminology, basically. You just have to understand that the standard deviation has to do with the mean, and it tells you how broad your scores were. So, let's say we're doing like something affecting memory. The mean, is in the middle. If you've got people who are, really, really low compared to the mean and also really, really high compared to the mean, so what we're kind of looking at here, it's a large standard deviation. So that means there's greater variance between the scores. And that's kind of telling you like you're doing something a little bit wrong. Because if you've got, again, this kind of miracle drug that's increasing people's memory, you've got the mean. If you've got people that are like really, really low on one end and people that are really, really high, then it's kind of like, what's going on to make people so different? Whereas if you've got a low standard deviation or a small spread, that means you've got less variance, which means everybody kind of got similar results, which is what you're wanting. Okay, so generalizing, this is really important in psych research. So you need to be able to, you've got your results. You're saying, okay, this drug is really good at improving everybody's memory, improving Alzheimer's, whatever it is. Can you generalize this to the population? So the question is, does your sample accurately reflect the greater population? And, the fact that this drug has worked in your sample, is it likely to work in the rest of the population? So therefore, to figure this out, you have to determine, is my sample representative or not, basically. So you need to think in terms of the sampling, like, is this random sampling? Is it stratified sampling? Are they actually represented? Have I used a big enough sample size so that I've got, again, a good representative of the population? Is the IV actually affecting the DV? I don't have any confounding variables. And then obviously, have I obeyed like kind of ethic principles? Is this experiment valid, basically? So if that kind of ticks everything, then you can generalize it to the population. This is super important. If there's one thing you remember from the scientific skills thing, let it be this. Screenshot it, do whatever you have to. Know this like the back of your hand. It's on improving stuff. You'll get questions about this. Here is, we've used a repeated measures design. How can we improve it? Counterbalancing. We've used convenient sampling. How can we generalize it? Random sampling. The experimenter knew what groups people were in. They unknowingly influenced them. Double-blind procedure. It's really, really important. Counterbalancing I haven't mentioned. So you have your repeated measures design. Remember, we've talked about, practicing or getting bored. Counterbalancing is when you take half of the group and they do one task and then the other half does the other, and then you swap. So let's say you've got task A and task B, you're controlling your experimental group ultimately. So instead of having all 50 participants do the group A task and then all 50 participants the next day doing your group B, which again could lead to the order effect. So influencing, the results based on performing the thing the same time, like the next day. Counterbalancing is when you have 25 people will do group A and then the group B task. And then the other 25 will do the group B task and then the group A task. And because you've switched the order, it means that this order effect has been cancelled out, basically. So people are doing it in a different order, which means there shouldn't be any influence on the result of kind of doing the tasks twice in a row. Because, some people did it, did this memory test under the influence of caffeine and then they didn't. And then some people didn't do it under the influence of caffeine and then the next day they did it. So that means that it's kind of balanced out. It's not this, everyone did it like this and then everyone did it like this. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, ethics, really, really important. Privacy, basically. Confidentiality, again, kind of privacy here. So not naming people, not making them identifiable. Voluntary participation, not coercing someone to participate, not punishing them or deterring them from not participating as well. Withdrawal rights, again, being free to withdraw, not punishing them for withdrawing. Informed consent, so they have understood everything that's going on in the experiment, they've understood the risks, they know the purpose of it, and they provide their written consent. If you are under the age of 18, or if you have like a mental health disorder, for example, you will get a parent or a guardian to sign this consent form. At the same time, and again, you go over this in year 12 as well, in the case of mental health disorders, you would not explain everything to the parent or the guardian and leave the participant in the dark. So let's say, for example, it's someone with perhaps like schizophrenia or something like that. You'd explain it to them to the best of their understanding and then, do the same with the parent or the guardian and get their consent. So you want the participant to be fully, or, to the best of their ability, aware of what's going on. But because legally you wouldn't deem them as having capacity, that's why you get the consent from the parent or the guardian. But it's not that you get the consent from the parent or the guardian and you don't tell the participant anything that's going on, because that's not ethical. That's not informed consent. Okay, so deception, basically when you lie about what's going on. So you can kind of think of this as, withholding information. And obviously this can be important in certain settings. But it has to obviously be, it can't cause, again, physical harm. It can't cause trauma. And you have to tell the participant about it after the experiment has been concluded. So deception can obviously be a little bit distressing and things like that. So you have to get explicit approval from the ethics committee to use deception in your study. And then debriefing. So that idea of revealing deception. But then even in experiments that haven't involved deception, debriefing is just kind of going over the results and letting everybody know what happened in the research, what the future, findings might be and stuff like that. Okay, so that is it for the most part. We'll just go over our last couple of questions before we end off. So a researcher wants to conduct an experiment with primary school students. Which of the following describes the most appropriate ethical approach for the researcher to take? So with these, the way I like to do it is just look at the first column, see what you can eliminate, and progress as you go down. So written consent from teacher and student. So a researcher wants to conduct an experiment with primary school students. The teacher is not the legal guardian. So that wouldn't be the right thing to do. Verbal consent, no, it has to be written. Verbal consent, no, it has to be written. So written consent from parent, guardian, and student. So already, based on this first column, C is kind of looking like the only right one here. So you can, if you're running really tight on time, you'd probably circle it and move on. But obviously we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that it is correct. So debriefing procedure available. Disclosure of deception before student takes part. That doesn't make sense. There's no point to deception if you're going to tell them about it before the experiment has occurred. Counselling offered at conclusion, again, only if necessary. If this experiment isn't, causing any kind of major psychological trauma or anything like that, probably not necessary. Whereas information about findings provided at the end of the experiment, pretty valid there. Again, wouldn't make sense to, outlining counselling options before experiment, again, valid, but only in the setting that it's necessary. So again, this one is looking like the best option. And then withdrawal rights, student can withdraw or parent guardian can withdraw student anytime. Sounds about right. Teacher can withdraw. Again, the teacher is not the legal guardian. If the teacher said something, you'd obviously probably flag it. But yeah, the student can withdraw or the parent guardian can withdraw them as well. But see how you can understand, even though you get the legal consent, the written consent, also from the parent and guardian and from the student as well, you don't need the parent or guardian to say that you want to withdraw them. If it's just the student that says it, that's enough to withdraw them as well. Because again, you can't keep them against their will. That's the opposite of withdrawal rights. Okay, so Lucinda read that a dog's breed influences, blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to skip this. But you can see one group of beagles and poodles to do this. In the second part of the experiment, Lucinda compared how many sessions of training were needed to get a different group of beagles. So a different group, we're thinking of independent groups design there because it's two different groups of participants. If Lucinda used the same beagles and poodles for both parts of the experiment, so i.e. if she used a repeated measures design, would she need to counterbalance the experiment? The answer should already be yes. So you can rule out A and C because we've got a repeated measures design. The order effect should be coming into it. So yes, because the order of the treats might affect the results, or yes, because the training order might affect the results. I will let you know as well, this question was answered poorly by students, so don't worry about it, if you're a little bit confused or you get it wrong, because it was answered poorly by year 12s, at the end of the year. But you can see here, you have to think about the independent variable, because remember counterbalancing, it's to eliminate the order effect, which is a confounding variable. So we're wanting to figure out what the IV is. So beagles and poodles to sit in a designated spot for 30 seconds using a dog biscuit as a reward versus getting them to sit in a designated spot for 30 seconds using a dog toy as a reward. So the consequence or the reward is the difference. So that's why we're thinking more so the order of the treats versus the training order, because the treats is what's actually changing. The training order isn't necessarily changing. They're sitting in the spot for 30 seconds, they're sitting in the spot for 30 seconds. It's this idea of they're sitting in the spot for 30 seconds and then they get a biscuit, or they're sitting in the spot for 30 seconds and they get a dog toy. So if you got everybody to do a dog biscuit and then everybody to do a dog toy, with the dog toy one, they might get better results because they've had practice at it. So that's why it's the order of the treats. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. So thinking about your kind of standard definitions of your skills here. At a university, 40 students participated in a study examining the effects of loud music on typing accuracy. Students were given a typing test to complete, with 20 students listening to loud music and 20 students without music. So what is the IV? So the thing that is manipulated. So you're just looking at what's different. The effects of loud music on typing accuracy. So you know that you're already testing loud music. So the thing that's changed is whether they listen to loud music or no music. The dependent variable is what's measured. So effects of loud music on typing accuracy. So the result of the typing test. Identify 2 uncontrolled variables in relation to the participants. So you've got 40 first-year psych students. You're subjecting them to a typing test and you are getting them to listen to music or no music. So you can think about uncontrolled variables. So this idea of, are some, already good at typing? Are they poor at typing? What do they usually listen to when they type? Even things like, how old are they, or certain characteristics, like intuitive characteristics, about these students as well. So you can see here the music, the typing accuracy, what they ate or drank. Again, this can be like literally anything, what they, if they slept the night before, anything that can affect typing accuracy. So again, the prior typing experience, hearing impairment or ability, because obviously you're listening to music. So yeah, heaps of answers you can write there. Get very, very confident with stuff like this. Identifying the IV, identifying the DV, coming up with a list of uncontrolled or controlled variables, and also thinking about what are some improvements that I can think about making to this experiment.